Well, honey, come sit yourself down here on the porch swing with me. I've been thinking about sharing this story with you for quite some time now, and I reckon it's about time you heard it. My name is Margaret Eleanor Whitmore, but folks have always called me Maggie. I'm 72 years old, been living here in Greenwich, Connecticut most of my life, and let me tell you something, I've seen more drama in these fancy neighborhoods than you'd find in any soap opera on television. You see, sweetheart, back in 2004, I thought my world was ending when my husband of 15 years, Richard Whitmore III, walked out on me for his secretary, a blonde bombshell named Tiffany, who was younger than his daughter from his first marriage. The whole country club was buzzing about it, and I felt like the biggest fool in all of Fairfield County. But what that arrogant man and his little gold digger didn't know was that this old gal had something up her sleeve that would turn their fairy tale into a nightmare. Stick around till the end, honey, and tell me what you would have done in my shoes when you discovered what I'm about to share with you. Tell me what state you're watching from. I love hearing from folks all across this great country. Hit that like button if you're enjoying this story, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life tales. Let me paint you a picture of how this all began. Dear, it was the spring of 1989 when I first met Richard at a charity gala at the Greenwich Country Club. I was 37 then, a widow with a successful interior design business, and he was this distinguished 45-year-old investment banker with steel gray hair and the kind of old money charm that could make your knees weak. His family had been in Connecticut since before the Revolutionary War, and their name was on half the buildings in downtown Greenwich. I'd been alone for 3 years after my first husband died in a car accident, raising my teenage daughter Sarah on my own. Richard swept me off my feet like something out of a romance novel. He'd send roses to my design studio every Friday, take me to the finest restaurants in Manhattan, and talk about building a life together that would honor both our families' legacies. The Whitmore estate sat on 12 acres overlooking Long Island Sound, a sprawling colonial mansion that had been in his family for 4 generations. When he proposed in 1990, right there in the rose garden his great-grandmother had planted, I thought I'd found my happily ever after. The wedding was the social event of the season, 300 guests, reception at the country club, and my picture in the Greenwich Times Society pages. But here's where it gets interesting. Honey, Richard's family had old money, but they also had old problems. His father had made some questionable investments in the 1980s, and by the time we married, the family fortune wasn't quite what it appeared to be. The estate was mortgaged to the hilt, and Richard's investment firm was struggling to stay afloat. That's when his lawyer, old Mr. Henderson, a man who'd been handling Whitmore family business since the Eisenhower administration, suggested we sign what he called a marital partnership agreement. Richard presented it to me as just a formality, something to protect both our interests and ensure the estate stayed in the family. I was so in love and so trusting that I'd barely read the fine print before signing those papers in Henderson's mahogany-paneled office. The smell of leather-bound law books and fresh coffee filled that room as I signed my name with Richard's gold fountain pen, the same pen his grandfather had used to sign business deals that built their fortune. Little did I know that those signatures would become the most important ink I'd ever put to paper.
Our marriage started out like a dream, sweetheart. I threw myself into being the perfect Connecticut wife, hosting dinner parties for Richard's business associates, volunteering for the right charities, and making sure our home was featured in Connecticut Magazine twice. I used my design skills to restore the Whitmore estate to its former glory, spending months hunting for authentic period pieces and supervising craftsmen who specialized in colonial architecture. Richard would come home from his office in Stamford every evening around 7, pour himself 2 fingers of scotch from the crystal decanter that had belonged to his great-grandfather, and we'd sit on the back terrace watching the sunset over the Sound. We'd talk about his day, my latest design projects, and our plans for the future. He wanted to expand his investment firm, maybe open an office in Manhattan. I dreamed of starting my own line of luxury home furnishings. Those were good years, honey. We traveled to Europe every summer, spending weeks in England and France, collecting antiques and art for the house. Richard knew so much about history and architecture. He could walk through a cathedral in France and tell you exactly which stones had been laid in the 12th century and which were restoration work from the 1800s. But around 1998, things started to change. Richard began working longer hours, claiming his clients needed more attention as the stock market got volatile. He'd come home later and later, sometimes not until after 10 o'clock, smelling like expensive perfume that definitely wasn't mine. When I'd ask about it, he'd say he'd been at business dinners with clients, and you know how some of those Wall Street wives douse themselves in Chanel No. 5. I started noticing other things too. Phone calls that would end abruptly when I walked into the room. Weekend golf trips to places that didn't seem to have golf courses. Credit card statements for restaurants I'd never been to and jewelry purchases I'd never received. But I pushed those thoughts away, telling myself I was being paranoid. The final straw came in March of 2004. I was reorganizing Richard's home office, something I did every spring to help him prepare for tax season, when I found a love letter tucked inside his desk blotter. It was written on pink stationery in loopy handwriting that looked like it belonged to a high school girl. The letter was signed, "Your devoted Tiffany," and talked about our magical weekend in the Hamptons, and how she couldn't wait to be Mrs. Richard Whitmore for. Now, honey, what would you have done if you'd found something like that? I sat in that oak-paneled office for what felt like hours, holding that letter in my trembling hands. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rug that I'd spent months finding at an estate sale in Boston. Everything in that room represented our life together. The family photos on the mantelpiece, the books we'd collected on our travels, the antique globe that Richard loved to spin while he was thinking about investments. But that letter changed everything. I wasn't just looking at furniture and books anymore. I was looking at 15 years of lies and deception. Instead of confronting Richard immediately, I decided to do what any smart Connecticut wife would do. I hired a private investigator. His name was Frank Morrison, a former police detective who specialized in what he delicately called domestic situations. Frank's office was in a strip mall in Norwalk, about as far from the manicured lawns of Greenwich as you could get while still being in the same county. Within 2 weeks, Frank had a file thick as a phone book. Photos of Richard and Tiffany at romantic restaurants in Manhattan. Hotel receipts from weekend getaways. Even pictures of them house hunting in Westchester County. Turns out my husband had been living a double life for over 3 years, and he was planning to leave me for this 28-year-old secretary who worked at his investment firm. But here's what really got my blood boiling. Sweetheart, Richard wasn't just planning to leave me. He was planning to leave me broke. Frank discovered that Richard had been systematically moving assets out of our joint accounts and into offshore investments that only he controlled. The man was trying to hide millions of dollars and leave me with nothing but the mortgage payments on a house I could never afford to maintain on my own. I'll never forget the evening Richard finally came clean. It was a Thursday in late April, and the dogwood trees were in full bloom around our property. He came home from work with that guilty look I'd been seeing more and more often, poured his usual scotch, and asked me to join him on the terrace. "Maggie," he said, not meeting my eyes, "we need to talk." I played dumb, even though my heart was pounding like a drum. "Of course, darling. What's on your mind?" "I think we both know this marriage hasn't been working for a while now," he said, swirling his scotch and staring out at the sound. "I've met someone else, and I think it's time we discussed making this separation official." The arrogance of that man, honey. He talked about our divorce like he was discussing a business merger, all calm and rational while my world was crumbling around me. He had the whole thing planned out. He'd move into a condo in Stamford temporarily. Tiffany would get her own place until the divorce was finalized, and then they'd buy a house together and start fresh. "What about our agreement?" I asked quietly. "What agreement?" Richard looked confused. The marital partnership agreement we signed in 1990. Richard actually laughed. Oh, that old thing? Henderson drew that up just to satisfy the family lawyers. It's basically meaningless. Just protects the estate and the business from being split up in a divorce. Don't worry, I'll make sure you're taken care of. But there was something they didn't count on about this American woman.
The next morning, I drove straight to New Haven to see my old friend Patricia Williams, who'd become one of the top family law attorneys in Connecticut. Patricia and I had known each other since college at Yale, and she'd built her reputation taking on exactly these kinds of cases. Wealthy Connecticut husbands who thought they could discard their wives like last season's fashions. Patricia's office was in one of those beautiful old buildings near the Yale campus, all dark wood and brass fixtures that spoke of serious legal business. I walked in carrying a copy of that marital partnership agreement, and Patricia's eyes lit up the moment she started reading it. "Maggie," she said, looking up at me with a grin that reminded me why she'd been the star of our debate team. "Do you have any idea what you signed here?" Richard said it was just to protect the family estate and business. Patricia laughed, not a happy laugh, but the kind of laugh a cat makes when it's cornered a mouse. "Oh, it protects things all right, but not the way your husband thinks it does." She explained it to me in terms I could understand. The agreement Richard had me sign in 1990 wasn't just about protecting family assets. It was what lawyers call a partnership conversion clause. If either spouse violated the terms of the marriage through adultery or financial deception, the innocent party would receive not just half the marital assets, but controlling interest in all business ventures and properties acquired during the marriage. According to this document, Patricia said, pointing to paragraph 7 with her manicured finger, Richard's investment firm, the Greenwich estate, and even his family's trust holdings could all become yours if we can prove he committed adultery and engaged in financial fraud. I felt like Dorothy when she clicked her ruby slippers and realized she'd had the power to go home all along. That agreement I'd signed so carelessly in 1990 was actually ironclad protection that Richard's own family lawyer had insisted upon to prevent exactly what Richard was now trying to do. But here's the best part. Honey, old Mr. Henderson, who'd drawn up that agreement, had passed away in 2001, and his son who took over the practice hadn't bothered to explain to Richard what he'd actually agreed to all those years ago. Richard thought he was protected by old family money traditions, but he'd actually signed his own financial death warrant. The confrontation happened on a beautiful May evening. Richard came home expecting to discuss the details of our amicable divorce, but instead found me sitting in the living room with Patricia and Frank Morrison, along with about 6 inches of legal documents spread across the coffee table that had been in his family for 150 years. "What's all this?" Richard asked, loosening his tie like he always did when he was nervous. "This," I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt, "is your wake-up call, darling." Patricia took over from there, and I have to say, watching a Yale-trained shark in a Chanel suit tear apart my cheating husband's assumptions was better than any show on Broadway. She laid out the evidence of his affair, the financial fraud, and the ironclad legal implications of the agreement he'd forgotten he'd signed. Richard's face went through about 6 different shades of pale as Patricia explained that according to the contract, his adultery and financial deception meant I was now entitled to controlling interest in Whitmore Investments, full ownership of the Greenwich estate, and access to family trust funds that he'd never even told me existed. "That's impossible," Richard stammered. "Henderson said that agreement protected the family assets." "It does," Patricia smiled. "It protects them from you. But there was something they didn't count on about this American woman. I wasn't done yet. Now here's where I really showed them what this Connecticut grandmother was made of, sweetheart." See, while Patricia was explaining the legal ramifications to Richard, I was watching his face carefully. And what I saw there wasn't just shock, it was panic. The kind of panic that told me there was something even bigger he was hiding. That's when I played my ace in the hole. "Frank," I said quietly, "why don't you show Richard the photographs from the Cayman Islands?" I wish you could have seen Richard's face. Honey, if he'd been pale before, now he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Because those photos Frank had taken during his investigation showed Richard and Tiffany not just on a romantic vacation, but meeting with offshore banking officials and signing documents that moved family trust funds, funds that weren't even supposed to be touchable according to his great-grandfather's will, into accounts that only he and Tiffany could access. "You've been embezzling from your own family's trust," I said calmly. "Money that was supposed to support your elderly Aunt Martha, your cousin's children's education funds, and the family foundation that supports the local historical society. You've been stealing from your own blood to set up a nest egg with your girlfriend." The room went dead silent, except for the sound of the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Richard sank into his leather chair, the same chair where his father used to read the Wall Street Journal every morning, and put his head in his hands. But I wasn't finished. See, while Richard thought he was being so clever moving money around, he'd forgotten that I'd been managing the household finances for 15 years. I knew every account, every investment, every trust fund distribution. And I'd been quietly documenting everything. "There's more," I continued, pulling out another folder. "Patricia, would you like to explain to Richard what happens when someone violates a family trust that was established in 1923? Patricia's smile could have powered the lighthouse at Greenwich Point. "It's called clawback provisions, Richard. When trust funds are misappropriated, not only must they be returned with interest, but the violator can be held personally liable for damages to all beneficiaries. We're talking about potentially $15 million in penalties." Richard's head snapped up. "15 million? That's impossible." "Oh, it gets better," I said. And I swear I felt just like Scarlett O'Hara when she swore she'd never go hungry again. "Because you moved those funds offshore without proper documentation. The IRS is going to be very interested in your tax returns for the past 5 years. Frank has copies of all the banking records." The beautiful part was watching the dominoes fall. Richard realized that not only was he losing everything in the divorce, but he was facing potential criminal charges for trust fund violations and tax evasion. His little love nest with Tiffany was about to become a prison cell. But the absolute best part, Tiffany had been expecting to marry into millions. When word got out about Richard's legal troubles, and in Greenwich, honey, word always gets out, she dropped him faster than a hot potato and ran back to her ex-boyfriend in New Jersey. Justice served Connecticut style, with a side of poetic irony. The legal proceedings took about 8 months to sort out completely, but by Christmas of 2004, I owned everything. The Greenwich estate, controlling interest in what was left of Whitmore Investments after the government finished with it, and access to the family trust funds that were rightfully mine under the partnership agreement. Richard ended up pleading guilty to tax evasion and trust fund violations. He served 18 months in a minimum security federal prison and had to pay back every penny he'd stolen plus penalties. When he got out, he was essentially broke and unemployable in the financial industry. Last I heard, he was selling insurance in Florida and living in a studio apartment. As for Tiffany, well, she learned a valuable lesson about counting chickens before they hatch. She lost her job at the investment firm when the whole scandal broke, and no other financial company in the tri-state area would hire her. She ended up moving back in with her parents in Newark and working at a nail salon. I decided to keep the Greenwich estate and turn part of it into a museum showcasing Connecticut colonial history. The Historical Society was thrilled, and it became a wonderful way to honor the property's heritage while providing educational opportunities for local schools. I donated a significant portion of the recovered trust funds to establish scholarships for young women studying business and law. I figured if these girls were going to navigate the corporate world, they needed to be prepared for men like Richard. My interior design business flourished after the publicity from the case. Apparently, wealthy Connecticut wives were very interested in hiring a designer who'd proven she was nobody's fool. I expanded into luxury home staging and consultation for high-end real estate, and my client list grew to include some of the most prominent families in Fairfield County. The irony wasn't lost on me that Richard's betrayal actually made me more successful than I'd ever been in our marriage. I was finally free to build my business on my own terms without having to consider his opinions or schedule my work around his social obligations. But perhaps the sweetest victory came 2 years later when I received a letter from Richard's elderly Aunt Martha. She thanked me for ensuring the family trust funds were properly restored and managed. She said she'd always suspected Richard was up to something, but she'd been too intimidated by his bluster to question him. "Margaret," she wrote in her elegant handwriting, "you saved our family's honor and legacy. We are forever in your debt." Now here I am, honey, 18 years later, sitting on the same back terrace where Richard used to drink his scotch and plan his deception. The view of Long Island Sound is just as beautiful as ever, and the estate is in better condition now than it's been in decades. I've got my gardens, my business, and most importantly, my self-respect. The whole experience taught me something important about America, sweetheart. This country was built by people who refused to be taken advantage of, who stood up for themselves when others tried to cheat them out of what was rightfully theirs. My great-great-grandmother came to Connecticut in the 1880s with nothing but a suitcase and a determination to build a better life. She would have been proud to see her descendant refuse to go quietly into that good night. I've watched this country change so much over my 72 years. Women have more opportunities now, more legal protections, and more support systems than we had when I was young. But some things never change. There will always be people who think they can take advantage of others, who believe their money or position gives them the right to treat people badly. The marriage contract I signed in 2004. Well, actually I signed it in 1990, but it proved its worth in 2004. It taught me that sometimes the best protection you can have is the thing you least expect. That agreement saved my life, my dignity, and my future. But more than that, it proved that even when someone thinks they hold all the cards, there's often something they've overlooked. I still keep that original contract in my safe, along with my grandmother's wedding ring and the deed to this beautiful property. Someday I'll pass it all on to my granddaughter, along with the story of how her grandmother learned that being underestimated can be a woman's greatest advantage. So tell me, honey, what do you think about all this? Have you ever been in a situation where someone underestimated you, where they thought they had you backed into a corner, but you found a way to turn the tables? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from folks who face their own challenges and come out stronger. Like and subscribe for more true American stories about resilience, justice, and the power of reading the fine print. And remember, sweetheart, in life, just like in legal contracts, the devil is always in the details. What state are you watching from? I get messages from folks all across this great country, and every single story reminds me that the American spirit of standing up for what's right is alive and well from sea to shining sea. Keep fighting the good fight, and never let anyone convince you that you don't deserve to be treated with respect and honesty. Trust me on this one. This old Connecticut grandmother knows what she's talking about.